You pray every day. You get down on your knees, close your eyes, raise your hands, rattle off the words you learned, and you feel like you're doing it right. But what if I told you there's a real shot, backed up by Jesus' own words, that the way most folks pray isn't landing where they think it is? Look, this ain't some cheap shot, no heresy here, it's written down, on record, spoken by Jesus of Nazareth himself, plain as day, leaving next to no room for spin. Think about it for a second. Ever prayed for something with everything you had, all your faith, all your heart, all your intensity, and the answer just didn't show? Felt like your prayers were hitting a concrete ceiling, the words going up but not landing anywhere. Ever quietly wondered if you were doing something wrong, but couldn't quite put your finger on it? If you nodded along to any of that, then what you're about to hear in this video isn't just important. It's urgent. Because there's something almost nobody's teaching in our churches, something even the biggest name preachers barely scratch the surface of. A principle Jesus laid down in the Gospels that, once you truly grasp it, completely flips your whole relationship with prayer, with God, with the spiritual side of things, and with your own life. This ain't another Pray More video. No quick tips for your prayer life. No religious pep talk to get you up at dawn on your knees for hours. What you're going to uncover here is why the prayers of millions good, honest, well-intentioned folks might be aimed at the wrong target. And worse, might be feeding a force they think they're starving. Jesus knew it. He talked about it. And his words have been on the books for almost 2,000 years, just waiting for someone to read them close enough to get what he was really saying. There's a detail in Jesus' prayer instructions, a piece of the puzzle hidden in plain sight that completely separates the prayer that transforms from the prayer that just echoes into nothing, and that detail changes everything. Absolutely everything. I'm going to show you exactly what it is. But first, you got to get the context. Without it, this revelation won't hit like it should. And I promise you, if you stick with this video till the end, you'll walk away seeing prayer in a way you never have before. The question is, are you ready to question what you've been taught? Because what's coming next might make you uncomfortable, might shake things up, might even sting a little. But that discomfort, that's the signal that something real is finally hitting a nerve that needed hitting a long time ago. So take a deep breath, because this video, it starts for real right now. Look, I had to make this video because this is one of the questions that lands in my inbox the most. People who've prayed for years, gone to church faithfully, read the Bible cover to cover, and still feel like something's missing from their prayer life. They feel a distance between themselves and God they can't explain, but it's there, silently, every single day. And what I dug up, really diving deep into Jesus' words, is that he didn't just teach how to pray. He also laid out, with pinpoint accuracy, the mistakes that make prayer ineffective, hollow, or even worse, aimed at the wrong target. In this video, you're going to get why mechanical prayer can be riskier than no prayer at all, what Jesus meant when he talked about the Father who sees in secret, why the intent behind the prayer matters more than the words you use, and how you can flip your prayer practice into something alive, real, and powerful, starting today. If this topic hits home for you, if you've ever felt there's something deeper to prayer than what you've been taught, hit that like button right now. It really helps this channel reach more folks who need to hear this. Subscribe too, so you don't miss the next videos, because what's coming is even deeper. And drop the word prayer in the comments below, just that. Prayer. So I know how many people are looking for a more real connection to the spiritual side of things. Let's get into it together. To really grasp what Jesus said about prayer, we first got to understand the world he lived in. And that world was drenched in religiosity. Not spirituality, mind you, but religiosity, two completely different animals. And that distinction, that's the heart of everything we're about to dig into here. Back in the 1st century AD, the regions of Judea and Galilee weren't places where religious practice was just some personal choice. It was about social identity, prestige, power. The Pharisees, the scribes, the priests, they all operated within a system where the appearance of devotion was often prized way more than the devotion itself. Praying out loud on street corners. Not uncommon. Long, visible fasts, wearing clothes that screamed piety, shouting prayers in the busiest spots, all part of the religious show of the day. Jesus was born into that scene, grew up in it. And when he kicked off his public ministry, one of the first things he did was directly challenge that whole setup. Not with violence, not with an army, but with words that cut like a scalpel, laying bare the difference between what men saw and what was real in the eyes of the divine. In the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most scrutinized spiritual documents in human history, Jesus sat down with his disciples and started picking apart, piece by piece, the performative religiosity that ran the spiritual game of the era. And it was in that context that he handed down the most detailed instructions on prayer you'll find in the Gospels. But what a lot of folks miss is that before he taught them how to pray, Jesus spent a good chunk of time explaining how not to pray. And that part of the lesson, that preventative, warning label part, that's exactly what's been softened, ignored, or flat out erased over centuries of Christian religious tradition. Jesus said something that should have rocked the entire religious establishment of the Western world. He said when you pray, you shouldn't be like the hypocrites. The Greek word there, hypocritai, originally meant stage actors, people wearing masks to play characters they weren't. Jesus was saying there's a kind of prayer that's pure theater, a show, an act put on for a human audience while pretending to talk to the divine. And here's the element you need to grasp with every ounce of attention you've got. Jesus wasn't just taking a shot at vanity. He was detailing a spiritual mechanism. When prayer is aimed, consciously or not, at human approval, at social applause, at building up some pious image for other people, it changes its destination. It doesn't land where it's supposed to. Think about that for a minute. How many churches today have services where the longest, most dramatic, most emotional prayer is the one that gets the most props? How many religious spaces, without even realizing it, are rewarding the exact kind of prayer Jesus called out as ineffective? But let's go deeper, because the problem isn't just the public, performative prayer. It's way more subtle than that. And it's this subtle issue that even hits folks who pray alone, in silence, in their bedroom, in the dead of night, when no one's watching. The question Jesus raises isn't just where you pray. It's who you're praying to. And that doesn't just mean the name you use for the divine. It means the force, the presence, the reality you're actually feeding with your attention, your words, your spiritual energy. There's a fundamental difference between praying from a place of love, of genuine connection, of truly seeking the divine, and praying from a place of fear, guilt, religious obligation, bargaining, or spiritual ego. And Jesus knew, with a clarity that cuts straight through religion, that these two kinds of prayer aren't hooking up with the same thing. When you pray out of fear that something bad's going to happen if you don't, you're feeding the fear. When you pray to feel more spiritual than other people, you're feeding the ego. When you pray out of obligation, like it's some chore to check off, you're feeding a religious system that's got squat to do with the God Jesus called Father. And the most unsettling part of all is that these prayers can have all the right language. They can use the sacred names. They can quote scripture. They can be long, elaborate, emotionally intense. And yet, because of the true destination of the intention behind them, they might not be reaching the Father Jesus described. The scribes of the first century knew the scriptures by heart. Every verse, every law, every tradition, they had it down cold. They prayed with impeccable formality. And Jesus told them they were miles from God. Not necessarily because they were bad people, but because the internal structure of their religious practice had disconnected from the spiritual reality it was supposed to nourish. This teaching, it's absolutely contemporary, maybe more relevant today than at any other point in history because we live in a time of social media, of live-streamed services, of morning devotional stories, a religious culture that, in a lot of ways, has technologically replicated exactly what Jesus was calling out on the street corners of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. What Jesus was trying to protect, with that warning, was something too precious to be wasted on a performance. He was safeguarding the chance for a real, direct, intimate, transformative connection with what he called the Father. A connection that doesn't need an audience, doesn't need validation, doesn't need fancy words. It just needs one thing, and that one thing is exactly what most folks never truly stop to consider. And it's that central element, that key that either opens or locks the door to true prayer, that we're going to dig into next. Because once you get this, the way you relate to the spiritual will never be the same. Alright, the reveal. And I need you to pay attention right now like it's the most important part of this video because in a way, it is. When Jesus taught the prayer that became known as the Lord's Prayer, he wasn't just handing out a template of words to parrot. He was transmitting a structure of consciousness, an internal architecture that, when truly understood, completely transforms what it means to pray. Most people growing up Christian learn the Lord's Prayer as something to recite. In Catholic churches, it's repeated dozens of times in rituals. In evangelical churches, it's often cited as a reference but rarely taught in its deeper structure. And the upshot. Billions of people have Jesus' words about prayer on the tip of their tongue, without having what he was really getting at on the tip of their consciousness. Let's look at the start of that prayer. Our Father in heaven. 3 opening words that carry a universe of meaning. Father. Our. In heaven. Father. Not Lord of hosts. Not supreme judge. not some impersonal cosmic force. Father. Jesus was introducing to the first-century Mediterranean world, dominated by images of powerful, angry, demanding, distant gods, a radically different idea. The divine as a father. Someone with whom there's a relationship of intimacy, security, belonging, unconditional love. But here's something hardly anyone notices. Jesus didn't teach his disciples to pray saying, "My Father." He taught them to say, "Our Father." That distinction is huge. By using "our," Jesus was anchoring prayer in a consciousness of community, of collective belonging, of interconnection among all who pray. You're not praying as some isolated individual trying to cut a deal with a distant supreme being. You're praying as part of a family, a whole, a shared reality. That right there busts one of the biggest myths of modern prayer, the idea that prayer is some private transaction where you hand over a shopping list to heaven and hope it gets filled based on your personal faith. Jesus was saying true prayer starts with recognizing you're not alone, that there's a spiritual family sharing the same source, the same Father, the same origin. But let's go even deeper. Because the most revolutionary part, the part that's been most systematically overlooked by religious tradition, is what comes next. Hallowed be your name. Most people read that as a phrase of praise, a declaration of reverence, and it is, but it's way more than that. In Hebrew, to hallow a name doesn't just mean recognizing it's sacred. It means making it manifest. It means the life of the person praying becomes a mirror of divine character in the world. It means prayer doesn't start with what you want, but with what you become. This completely flips the logic of petitionary prayer. Most folks start praying thinking about what they need. Jesus proposed starting with who God is. And that inversion isn't some minor protocol detail. It's a perspective shift that changes the entire frequency of the prayer. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Here's another bombshell that got diffused by automatic repetition. Jesus was teaching his disciples to pray not so God would change his plans according to human desires, but so human reality would align with divine reality. Prayer, in this model, isn't an attempt to bend God's will. It's an opening of your own consciousness to receive and manifest what's already true in the spiritual realm. That has immense implications. If prayer is alignment, not negotiation, then the question isn't how many times you repeat the request or with how much emotional intensity you do it. The question is how much you're willing to transform yourself so that what you're asking for can manifest through you. And here's the point that connects all this back to Jesus' warning about the hypocrite's prayer. The prayer that feeds the ego, the performative prayer, the mechanical prayer, they all have one thing in common. They're not open to the transformation of the one praying. They're asking the world to change while the person praying stays exactly the same. True prayer, according to Jesus' model, is dangerous for the ego, because it starts with a willingness to be transformed, to have your own will replaced by something bigger, to become an instrument of the reality you're invoking. And that's exactly what most people, unconsciously, aren't looking for when they pray. They want the new car, the better job, the healing from sickness, the problem solved. And those aren't bad things to ask for. Jesus also said we can ask for our daily bread. But the context in which that request is made, the structure of consciousness it springs from, determines whether it's aligned with the Father Jesus described or with the religious ego that uses God's name to sanctify its own desires. There's a tradition within Christian mysticism, practically vanished from today's mainstream churches, that called this contemplative prayer or quiet prayer. Masters like Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, they all taught that the deepest prayer isn't where you talk the most, but where you quiet yourself enough to listen. To let yourself be shaped, to become transparent to the divine instead of using the divine as a tool for the human. And this teaching, this golden thread running through 2,000 years of Christian tradition, is precisely what the institutional religious system has the hardest time getting across, because it can't be easily sold, doesn't whip up emotional crowds, doesn't produce spectacles, doesn't fund megachurches or huge building projects. But that's exactly what Jesus was describing when he talked about praying in secret, when he talked about the Father who sees what's done in secret. The secret Jesus mentioned isn't just a physical spot, your locked bedroom, your bathroom, your quiet porch. The secret is an inner state. It's the space where the ego has no audience, where there's nothing to prove, no image to uphold, where the only possible spectator is the divine. And it's in that space, according to Jesus, that true prayer happens. That's where the answer comes. Not because God's more accessible when you're alone, but because you're more accessible to God when the ego isn't operating in performance mode. This revelation, this understanding of the internal architecture of prayer, according to Jesus, completely shifts the question you need to ask yourself before you pray. The question stops being, what am I going to ask for today? And becomes, where is this prayer coming from inside me? From fear? From ego? From obligation? Or from a place of genuine openness, of real love, of a sincere desire for alignment with something bigger than myself? Because the answer to that question, according to Jesus himself, doesn't just determine the quality of your prayer. It determines where it goes. There's a moment many people have lived through, but few can actually name. It's when you're in the middle of a prayer, maybe at a service, maybe at home, and you suddenly realize you're just reciting words without feeling a blessed thing. The words are there, your lips are moving, the ritual's executed perfectly, but inside, there's an unsettling emptiness, a distance no words seem to be able to cross. That moment is uncomfortable because it flies in the face of everything we've been taught about prayer. We were told praying more would fix it. That praying with more intensity, more tears, more shouting, more anointing, would finally fill that void. But the truth Jesus pointed to, and what most institutional religious traditions shy away from discussing openly, is that this emptiness isn't of a lack of faith. It might be a sign that the prayer has been hollowed out from the inside by a mechanism far deeper than a simple lack of emotion. Think about it with me. Ever watched how people pray in different religious settings? In a traditional Catholic church, there's a pattern of fixed words, specific body postures, designated moments for kneeling, standing, sitting. Repetition is part of the ritual. In a Pentecostal evangelical church, the pattern's different but just as standardized. Intense emotional expression, speaking in tongues, crying, movement, a spontaneity that, weirdly enough, follows pretty predictable patterns. In a more conservative Presbyterian or Baptist church, there's a solemn seriousness, a formality that signals reverence. All these styles have their value. They all have historical and theological roots. But they all also carry a common risk. The risk of becoming forms without content, shells without the substance they're supposed to hold. And the interesting thing is, this risk isn't new. It's exactly what Jesus was describing when he talked about the hypocrites on the street corners and those who thought they'd be heard for their many words. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 7, Jesus says something absolutely, and it was startling for its time, still is for ours. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, when you pray, don't just parrot words like folks who think the more they talk, the more God's gonna listen. Then he dropped this. Don't be like them, because your Father already knows what you need, long before you even open your mouth. Hold up a second, because that line right there, that's a theological truth bomb most churches can't detonate without blowing up their own business model. Jesus is telling you God already knows what you're about, what you're hurting for, before you even ask. So, what's the point of asking? Why pray? If the big guy already knows, what's the deal? That question, if you let it hit you honest, it rattles the whole religious establishment built on the idea that the quantity and intensity of your prayers dictate the blessings you get. That setup implies, directly or indirectly, that you gotta sweet-talk God. That you gotta remind God of your needs. That your persistence in prayer is what finally twists the divine will in your favor. And Jesus is basically saying, nah, that's not how it works. Your Father already knows, already saw it, already got the intel, before you utter a single word. So prayer isn't about informing God. It's not about convincing God. It's not about racking up spiritual points to cash in for favors and blessings. Prayer, according to Jesus, is something else entirely. It's a practice of alignment, of opening up, of inner transformation that lets the one praying receive what the divine is already ready to give. And that brings us to a question that hits hard for anyone who takes prayer seriously. If prayer isn't about changing God, but about changing us, then what happens when we pray repeatedly for the same thing without any real internal willingness to be transformed by the process? The answer that surfaces from Jesus' teachings is unsettling but also incredibly liberating, that prayer isn't getting through to the Father. It's just bouncing around inside the prayer's own system, feeding those thought patterns, the fears, the limiting beliefs, the control mechanisms that are asking for change but resisting it with everything they've got. If you're feeling the weight of that, if any part of what I'm describing is hitting a nerve you've carried for years, a question you never knew how to ask but always felt, just type the word secret in the comments. That's it. Just the word secret. Because that's where real prayer happens, according to Jesus. In the secret place. In the inner silence. Away from the performance. Away from obligation. Away from mechanical repetition. And I want to know how many of you watching this video have already caught onto this, have felt that there's a deeper level of connection to the spiritual that goes beyond everything you've been taught. Comment secret below if you're awake to it. And stick around, because what's coming next goes even deeper. We're about to dive into the evidence, the historical and spiritual proofs that back up everything we've just explored. And what you're about to discover is going to change how you read the Bible forever. The evidence that supports what Jesus taught about prayer isn't just in the Gospels. It's scattered across millennia of history, philosophy, contemplative science, traditions that existed long before Christianity and that converge, with unnerving precision, on the same principles Jesus laid out in the Sermon on the Mount. Let's start with what historians call the Second Temple period. Judaism in Jesus' day was a living, complex tradition, split into factions that debated Scripture with an intensity few people today can even imagine. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, each group had its own take on what it meant to connect with God. And in that landscape, Jesus' teaching on prayer was radically different from anything out there. The scribes and Pharisees had spent centuries developing a system of mandatory prayers called the Amida or Shemone Esrei, the 18 blessings. These prayers were recited 3 times a day, standing, facing Jerusalem, with a ritualistic precision that allowed no deviation. They were beautiful, deep stuff, rooted in the Hebrew scriptures. But the whole system was anchored in the idea that correct ritual performance was what guaranteed your relationship with God. Jesus didn't reject Jewish prayer, he radicalized it. He went inside it and pulled out the living principle the ritual was trying to protect but which had gotten buried under layers of formality. And by doing that, he created a problem for every religious structure that came after. Because a prayer that can't be controlled, that can't be standardized, that can't be sold as a religious service, is a prayer that slips right out of institutional control. The Dead Sea Scrolls, unearthed in 1947, brought to light texts from the Essenes, a Jewish community living in the Judean desert around the same time as Jesus. And what those texts reveal is fascinating. The Essenes had also figured out that the religious system in Jerusalem had become corrupted by performance. They retreated to the desert precisely to find a more authentic spiritual practice. And their texts repeatedly talk about the importance of inner purity as a prerequisite for any real communication with the divine. That doesn't mean Jesus was an Essene. Scholars have been duking that out for decades. But it does mean that, in the first century, there was a growing awareness that something had been lost in the official religion. And Jesus was the most articulate, powerful, and enduring voice of that recognition. Now let's jump to the Greek world, because Jesus didn't live in some isolated Jewish cultural bubble. First-century Galilee was a deeply Hellenized region, exposed to Greek philosophy for over 3 centuries since Alexander's conquests. And in Greek philosophy, especially among the Stoics and Neoplatonists, there's an impressive echo of what Jesus taught about prayer. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor-philosopher, wrote in his Meditations, in the 2nd century AD, something that sounds remarkably familiar. The quality of a person's life corresponds to the quality of their thoughts. The Stoics taught that the Logos, the divine reason permeating the universe, wasn't an entity that needed persuasion or negotiation. It was a reality with which humans needed to align themselves through inner discipline, purity of intention, and refusing to let the ego and its disturbances dictate the relationship with reality. Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, who lived in the 3rd century, described the human soul as something that naturally moves toward the one, the divine, when it sheds the impurities that trap it. And what trapped the soul, for Plotinus, was exactly what Jesus called religious hypocrisy. The inner fragmentation, the gap between what a person pretends to be and what they truly are. These convergences aren't accidental. They point to a perception that transcends any specific tradition. That genuine communication with the divine, whatever you call that divine, requires an inner authenticity no ritual alone can guarantee. And modern science, specifically neuroscience and contemplative psychology, is starting to confirm what these ancient teachings intuited millennia ago. Studies done at Harvard University with practitioners of contemplative meditation, a form of silent prayer directly rooted in Christian mysticism, showed measurable changes in the structure of the prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation, empathy, and perspective taking. The regular practice of an inner focus that doesn't seek immediate results, but simply opens itself to the presence of what's real, produces neurological transformations that mechanical, repetitive practice doesn't. It doesn't mean God is just some brain state. It means humans are wired with a capacity for connection to the transcendent that only activates when certain internal conditions are present. And those conditions, authenticity, inner stillness, open-mindedness without an agenda, are precisely what Jesus described when he spoke of praying in secret to the Father who sees what's done in secret. The evidence is everywhere for anyone with eyes to see. And the question it raises, the question you need to carry with you into the next part of this video, is this. If all this is so clear, if Jesus' teachings on prayer are so precise, so well documented, so corroborated by other traditions and by science itself, why do most churches in the world still teach prayer the way they do? Why does the model of mechanical, performative, ritualistic repetition remain the dominant standard? The answer to that question is uncomfortable, and it's exactly what we're going to explore now. There's a word rarely uttered in Sunday sermons when the history of Christian prayer comes up. That word is control. Because understanding why certain teachings of Jesus about prayer were systematically silenced over the centuries requires understanding who had an interest in silencing them, and why. When Emperor Constantine converted the Roman Empire to Christianity in the early 4th century, something fundamental shifted in the nature of the movement Jesus had kicked off. What was a decentralized spiritual practice, passed from person to person, community to community, through letters, gatherings, shared meals, gradually transformed into an institution with a hierarchical structure, political power, and a vested interest in standardizing, controlling, and defining what was orthodox, that is, what was the correct teaching. And in this process of institutionalization, certain elements of Jesus' teaching got pushed to the sidelines, not necessarily out of deliberate malice in every case, but by the natural mechanics of any institution that needs to manage a large number of people. Simplification, standardization, reducing the complex to the manageable. Contemplative prayer, the prayer of quietude, the prayer Jesus described as going into your room, shutting the door, and praying to the Father in secret, that kind of prayer isn't easily managed by an institution. It can't be taught in 5 minutes. It doesn't put on a show. It doesn't generate the collective emotional cohesion that keeps large congregations together and financially active. What is manageable is standardized ritual, fixed liturgy, the rosary with its counted repetitions, the service with its predictable structure, tithing as a mandatory spiritual practice. I'm not saying all these practices are worthless. Some of them hold deep wisdom within their forms. But I am a ter unseveria of vis musical, but I am a kepsfy unis. But I hundir the povel frione we have. But their mormond is came to fugjibeda of hers and erlit. Like for see the moody appearance of Fairland to be called. One induction were family of humans. When the ritual replaces the reality it's supposed to point to, exactly what Jesus warned against is happening. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was a landmark in this standardization process. Decisions were made there about the canon, the nature of Christ, the structure of ecclesiastical authority, shaping Christianity in ways that endure to this day. And many of the voices that were excluded in that process, the Christian Gnostics, the mystics, the groups that emphasized direct spiritual experience instead of institutional mediation, carried precisely the elements of Jesus' teaching that were gradually erased from the mainstream. The Gnostic Gospels, especially the Gospel of Thomas, rediscovered among the Nag Hammadi scrolls in Egypt in 1945, contain sayings attributed to Jesus that resonate impressively with what we're exploring here. In saying 3, for example, Jesus is quoted saying, "If those who lead you say, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you and it is outside you." This saying isn't considered canonical by traditional churches, but it echoes something clearly in the canonical Gospels. Jesus' assertion in Luke chapter 17 that the kingdom of God doesn't come with outward show, and that it's among you, or within you, depending on the translation. If the kingdom of God is within, then the prayer that seeks the kingdom of God can't just be an external practice. It has to be a practice of introspection, of going inward, of connecting with what's deepest and most real within the human being. And that understanding was progressively suppressed by a religious structure that had every interest in keeping the divine on the outside, accessible only through authorized mediators, approved rituals, correct formulas. The medieval Inquisition persecuted mystics who taught a direct experience of God without institutional mediation. Meister Eckhart, one of the greatest Christian mystics of all time, had his teachings condemned posthumously by Pope John XXI Medius alone. Of Schuchtelieb to late has becabiles Caroliniget and Bertuanite religion. Lated Stopsushamios forgoning as moral signal and of vos terrence to file at hero anno. As axtainculation cronsmaslu as televover 40 clods like Ida Kumgobatter. All of them were deeply Christian people who were simply teaching the direct contemplative prayer Jesus had described. The pattern is too consistent to be a coincidence. Whenever someone got too close to prayer as Jesus described it as an inner, direct practice, without intermediation, without obligatory ritual, without performance, the structures of religious power responded with suspicion, condemnation, silencing. And today, in the 21st century, that silencing doesn't need an inquisition anymore. It happens simply through noise, through the saturation of religious content that keeps people busy with the surface of practices without ever getting to the roots, through the model of religious entertainment that confuses intense emotion with genuine spiritual experience, through the spectacle culture that has made performative prayer not just acceptable but desirable because it generates engagement, shares, views. The hidden truth about prayer isn't in some secret book locked in a Vatican vault. It's in plain sight, in the very words of the Gospels, waiting to be read by someone willing to take them seriously. You, watching this video, are that someone. And what comes next, the deepest philosophical and spiritual dimension of everything we've explored, is what's finally going to tie all these threads together into an understanding you can take home and apply to your life starting tomorrow. All the great spiritual traditions of the world, without exception, have arrived at a common insight that can be expressed in different ways but points to the same reality. This insight is that there's a dimension of human experience deeper than thoughts, deeper than emotions, deeper than the socially constructed identity, a dimension that is in permanent contact with something that transcends the individual without annihilating them. Buddhists call it Buddha nature. Hindus call it Atman connected to Brahman. Islamic Sufis call it Fana, the dissolution of the ego in the presence of the divine. Jewish Kabbalists call it Neshama, the deepest soul that is a spark of Ein Sof, the infinite. And Jesus called it the Father who is in secret. The convergence is extraordinary. Each tradition uses different language, different images, different practices, but all point to the same truth, that there's a level of access to the divine available to every human being that doesn't depend on institutional mediation, that can't be bought or sold, and that becomes accessible when a person stops, quiets down, and opens themselves to something greater than themselves. From this perspective, prayer isn't a technique for communicating with an external being. It's a practice of recognizing a presence that's already here, that never left, that only became obscured by the ego's noise, by the agitation of thoughts, by the religious compulsion to do, to speak, to prove, to perform. The philosopher-theologian Paul Tillich, in the 20th century, described God not as a being among other beings, but as the ground of all being, the depth of reality that sustains everything that exists. And from this perspective, praying isn't sending a message to a distant address. It's descending to the foundation of one's own existence, where the separation between the human and the divine dissolves not because the human becomes God, but because the human becomes transparent to the divine that has always been at its core. This resonates powerfully with Jesus' words in John chapter 17, when he prays to the Father and says, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us. This prayer of Jesus, uttered on the eve of his death, is one of the most radical affirmations of the unity between the human and the divine found in any sacred literature. And it suggests that true prayer isn't the human trying to reach a distant God, but the human recognizing and inhabiting the unity that already exists. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk who became one of the greatest spiritual writers of the 20th century, described contemplative prayer as a process of shedding the masks. Not just social masks, but religious masks, spiritual masks, the identity of a devout person, an exemplary Christian, a dedicated worshiper. Everything that builds an image of holiness before oneself and others needs to be set aside for real prayer to happen. And he was even more direct when he said that many people use religion to avoid God, to keep the divine organized, predictable, domesticated, within categories the ego can manage. True prayer, according to Merton, is what takes us beyond the comfort of religious categories to an encounter with a mystery that can't be controlled, can't be negotiated, can't be reduced to a formula. This is exactly what Jesus was protecting when he warned against the prayer of hypocrites and against vain repetitions. He was protecting the possibility of a real encounter, of real transformation, of a connection that can't be faked, can't be performed, can't be produced by technique, by emotional intensity, or by the sheer volume of words. And here's the question I want you to carry. In your spiritual life, in your prayers, in your moments of seeking the divine, have you been chasing a real encounter? Or have you been settling for the comfort of familiar forms, the relief of religious routine, the security of doing what's always been done the way it's always been done? If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now's the time. Hit that subscribe button below and ring the bell, because the next videos are going to keep digging deep into this very territory, the spirituality that goes beyond religiosity, the encounter with the divine that transcends performance. You don't want to miss it. And now I gotta ask you a direct question, one I want you to answer in the comments with total honesty. Have you ever had a prayer experience that was genuinely transformative, that truly changed something in you, not just made you feel good for a few hours, but left a lasting mark? A constant, abiding prayer life, Comment below, yes or no. That's it. Yes if you've experienced this kind of prayer. No if you're still searching for it, because I want to know where you are on this journey, and what's coming up next is crafted specifically for wherever you find yourself. I want you to take a pause right now. Not a pause in the sense of stopping this video, but an internal pause. A moment of genuine reflection on what's been said so far and what it means specifically for your life, for your story, for your unique spiritual path. Because we've reached a point in this video where the information has been presented, the evidence laid out, the historical and philosophical contexts explored. And now the question isn't intellectual anymore. The question is personal. Deeply, uncomfortably personal. Who taught you to pray? Really think about that. Not the quick, easy answer, not I learned it in church or my mom taught me. Think about the images implanted in you about what God is like, about how God listens, about what happens when you pray. Those images came from someone, from a family, from a pastor, a priest, a Sunday school teacher, a grandparent who knelt by their bed every night. And those images, received when you were still a child, when your mind was completely open and without critical defenses, those images became the operating system for your spiritual life. Most people never stop to question that operating system. They live their entire lives operating from images of God that were installed in childhood images that might be full of love and wisdom, or they might be full of fear, conditionality, distance, demands of a God who loves but who needs to be constantly appeased, convinced, reminded of your needs. And here's the point I want to sink deep within you. The God you pray to is, in large part, the God you envision when you close your eyes. And that imagined God can be very different from the Father Jesus described. It can be more severe, more distant, more conditional, more unpredictable. It can be a God you need to earn, whom you need to impress, whom you need to convince that your cause is righteous enough to receive divine attention. If that's the God you've been praying to, then the problem isn't your faith, it's the image. And changing that image, replacing the God of fear with the Father of love that Jesus described, is the most profound and liberating work a human being can do in their spiritual life. Jesus offered glimpses of what this Father is like. In the parable of the prodigal son, which perhaps should be called the parable of the merciful Father, he painted a portrait of the divine that still today has the power to dismantle decades of theology built on merit and performance. The father in the parable doesn't wait for his son to come to him to forgive. He sees the son still a long way off, runs to meet him, and before the son finishes his carefully rehearsed speech of repentance, he's already embracing him, calling for a celebration, restoring the dignity of one who was lost. This is the opposite of a God who needs to be persuaded. This is a God who has already moved toward you before you finish the sentence of your prayer. And praying to God has an entirely different quality than praying to the demanding, distant God many of us unknowingly inherited. Now I ask you directly, when you close your eyes to pray, what sensation is present in your body? Is it a feeling of openness, of security, of being expected, of coming home? Or is it a feeling of tension, of effort, of trying to reach for something just out of grasp, of needing to use the perfect words to ensure the message gets through? That sensation, that bodily state that accompanies prayer, is one of the most honest indicators of the God you're praying to. Because the body doesn't lie the way theological concepts can. The body registers the real experience, not the experience we're supposed to have, according to what we've been taught. And the transformation Jesus made possible, with his teaching about prayer, begins right at that point. It begins with the honesty of recognizing, I have been praying from fear. I have been using prayer to try and control the uncontrollable. I have performed devotion for an audience that includes my own idealized image of myself as a spiritual person, and none of that is the prayer Jesus described. This recognition is no cause for shame. It is the beginning of immense freedom. Because when you stop pretending that your prayer is what it isn't, when you finally drop to a level of total honesty before the divine, something shifts. The space that was once occupied by performance, by effort, by the anxiety of getting it right, that space opens up. And it's in that open space that real prayer, real connection, real encounter can finally happen. That's exactly why Jesus said the Father sees in secret. Because in secret, in the inner silence where there's nothing left to prove to anyone, not even to yourself, that's where you finally become accessible to what has always been waiting for you. This reflection isn't meant to leave you paralyzed by self-criticism. It's meant to point you to a door you may never have fully walked through, but one that has always been there waiting. And the question I leave for you to carry with you is simply this. Are you ready to truly pray? Not more. Not with more elaborate words. Not with more hours on your knees. But truly. With all your humanity exposed, no mask, no script, no performance. Ready to encounter the Father Jesus described. If the answer is yes, then what comes next is for you, because we're going to turn all of this into something you can put into practice in your very next prayer. So we've reached the point where theory needs to become life, because spiritual knowledge that doesn't transform into practice is just more consumed content, more accumulated information without integration. And Jesus' teaching on prayer was always aimed at real, concrete, verifiable transformation in the lives of those who receive it. The first practical thing you can do, and it will immediately change your prayer experience, is to create what I'll call a settling in moment before you start to pray. Instead of immediately launching into words, requests, or verbal praise, spend the first 2 or 3 minutes simply in silence. Not meditating in a technical sense, not trying to empty your mind. Just sitting, breathing, letting the noise of the day begin to settle. During this initial silence, notice what's present. What emotions are active? What's the state of your body? Is there anxiety, tiredness, expectation, fear, gratitude? Don't judge what you find. Just observe. And then, with all of that present, with all your real humanity, not some idealized version of it, with all of that, open yourself to the Father Jesus described. This simple practice does something powerful. It breaks the automatic pilot. It prevents prayer from starting in autopilot mode, which is where vain repetitions happen, where words come out while your consciousness is elsewhere. It anchors you in the present, in the real, in the now, which is the only place where an encounter with the divine can happen. The second practice Jesus implicitly but clearly suggests is radical honesty in prayer. Not formally correct language, not words that sound spiritually appropriate, but the truth of what you're feeling, thinking, needing, fearing. The Psalms are the greatest model of this in the Hebrew Scriptures. David didn't filter his communication with God. He expressed anger, despair, confusion, jealousy, vengeance, overflowing joy, intense gratitude. The complete range of human experience was brought into the divine presence without prior censorship. This is completely different from the model of prayer many people learned, where there's an implicit list of appropriate things to say to God and things you keep to yourself because it would be irreverent to express them in prayer. But true irreverence, according to Jesus' teaching, isn't bringing your anger or despair to God. It's showing up in the divine presence wearing a mask, presenting a sanitized version of yourself that you judge to be more acceptable. The Father who sees in secret sees what you're feeling anyway. The question is whether you will be honest about it in your prayer, which creates alignment and openness, or if you will filter, which creates distance and inner fragmentation. The third practice is what I'll call the prayer of surrender. It is simultaneously the most difficult and most transformative practice. It's the moment when, after bringing everything you're carrying into the divine presence, you let go, not in the sense of giving up, of abandoning, but in the sense of trusting, of opening the hands that were tightly gripping control of the situation and recognizing that there is a wisdom greater than your own operating in the circumstances of your life. Jesus modeled this in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his death. He brought his real anguish, his complete humanity, his honest desire for that ordeal to pass. And then he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." This is not passive resignation. It is the most courageous act possible. Trusting that the Father who sees in secret is operating in dimensions that human sight cannot grasp. The fourth practice is simple and revolutionary. Pray with fewer words. Don't pray less. Pray with fewer words. Jesus said that the Father already knows what you need before you ask. So instead of a 20-minute prayer explaining your situation in detail, try a 2-minute prayer where you simply name what's present, what you need, what you're feeling, and then sit in silence, receiving, opening. Waiting not with anxiety, but with the quiet expectation of someone who knows they are before a Father who has already moved to meet them. The fifth practice is to integrate prayer into the flow of life instead of confining it to formal moments. Paul wrote to pray without ceasing, which cannot mean spending your entire life on your knees with your eyes closed. It means developing an inner state of openness, of awareness of the divine presence that permeates everyday activities. Washing dishes can be prayer. Driving can be prayer. A difficult conversation with a child can be prayer if it's lived with an awareness of the presence of the Father Jesus described. This is not pantheism. It is not a dilution of the sacred. It is exactly the opposite. It is the sacralization of the everyday. The recognition that the divine is not confined to moments of organized worship, but present in every dimension of human existence that opens itself to receive it. And here's a case study I want to share. It's not about a famous historical figure. It's the kind of story that happens in silence, without cameras, without witnesses, and it's precisely for that reason that it carries the weight of authenticity. A woman who had prayed all her adult life, who attended church twice a week, who led a prayer group, decided, after going through a crisis that none of her usual prayers seemed to touch, to try exactly what Jesus described: go to her room, close the door, sit in silence, and simply be honest. No script. No perfect words. No performance of faith that she had practiced for decades. She said the first time was unsettling. She sat in the silence and didn't know what to do. The entire structure of her prayer life had been built on doing, saying, performing. Without that, she was disoriented. But she kept going. And by the third week, something happened that she described as the most real encounter with the divine she had ever had in her entire religious life. There were no voices, no visions. There was simply a presence that she recognized as being exactly what she had been searching for in every prayer, in every service, in every act of devotion, but which had been obscured by all the religious activity she had accumulated around it. This is what's available to you. It's what Jesus was describing, and it's closer than you think. You've made it this far, and that alone says something about you. While most people give up at the first sign that content will demand something of them, will challenge what they think they know, will rattle comfortably established structures, you stayed. You listened. You considered. And that is exactly the kind of inner disposition Jesus was describing when he spoke of who has ears to hear. Everything we've explored here points to a core truth Jesus clearly laid out. True prayer isn't performance. It isn't mechanical repetition. It isn't negotiation with the divine. It isn't the accumulation of spiritual merit. It is a real encounter between your complete humanity and a Father who is already present, who is already moving toward you, who already sees everything you carry in the deepest secret of who you are. If this video stirred something real within you, if it opened up a question you'll carry with you, do this channel a huge favor and hit that like button right now. It seems simple, but it makes all the difference in getting this content out to more people who are searching for exactly what you found here today. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because what's coming next on this channel will continue further exploring this very territory, the spirituality that goes beyond religiosity, the prayer that transforms instead of just repeating, the encounter with the divine that Jesus made possible for every human being without exception. And for those of you who stuck around to the very end of this video, I want you to comment down below the words real encounter. That's it. Real encounter. That's it. And Tarmer Eslut, that there's not horrors for bad main tree and dean for meany drows. 9 do you win. As what it said to Alan made dear like fears that the war like field porcarubidius. The Berman Sleer, Jusum Kamon your safely wonder and Yeltagal. Kamon your I ramage toff cleated the bedamly toolmail. Check out the video appearing on your screen right now. It's directly connected with what we've just explored here, and I believe it will take you even deeper on this journey. Don't put it off. Click it now and keep going with me.